Netflix making news this week with a new documentary featuring never-before-seen video of Sean Diddy Combs in moments that he clearly viewed as secret, including a high-stakes call with his lawyer just days before his now infamous arrest, plus Diddy reacting in real time as new lawsuits dropped against him.
Netflix's new documentary didn't just expose Diddy, it ended the story he's been telling for 20 years. One detail he built his entire defense on has finally been proven false. And now the truth he avoided for 2 decades is out in the open. What Netflix revealed changes everything. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think Diddy ever expected Netflix to expose this after all these years? And if you want every hidden twist they tried to bury, make sure you subscribe to the hidden evidence so you never miss the truth behind the headlines.
One could watch this and think that you really hate Sean Combs.
Why would they be thinking that?
Because of the things that you post on Instagram,
Yeah,
because
this,
of the...
Look at this, and let's stop for a second and do say that.
The release of the documentary on December 3rd shattered an illusion that Diddy relied on for nearly 2 decades. For years, whenever accusations resurfaced, whenever lawsuits returned to the headlines, whenever an interviewer pushed too hard, he fell back on the same defense. A single detail that supposedly proved his innocence. A line he repeated with confidence, sometimes calmly, sometimes aggressively, but always consistently. Over time, it became more than a statement. It became a shield, a script, a piece of his identity. But this documentary pulled that shield apart. From the beginning, viewers expected Netflix to recap the rumors, summarize past controversies, and offer commentary. But Netflix didn't summarize, they investigated. And what they found wasn't a reinterpretation of old events. It was a contradiction so direct, so clear, and so undeniable that it immediately rewrote the entire timeline everyone thought they understood. The reveal comes quietly, no dramatic sound cues, no flashing text, just a simple interview, someone the public never heard from, someone whose name barely exists in the old files, a missing voice finally allowed to speak. And the moment they begin talking, everything Diddy claimed for 20 years collapses. Their testimony doesn't challenge one detail, it destroys it. Their version isn't emotional or exaggerated, it's factual, steady, and supported by documentation Netflix displays on screen. For the first time, viewers saw how the timeline Diddy repeated for years simply didn't match the actual sequence of events. Netflix then cuts to archival clips of Diddy over the last 2 decades, interviews from 2003, 2007, 2011, 2018, and beyond. Same story, same phrasing, same tone. The documentary places these interviews side by side with time-stamped evidence, showing the audience precisely where reality diverges from Diddy's narrative. The contradiction is so sharp that even longtime supporters were left stunned. Social media exploded. People rewound the footage, freeze-framed the evidence, and compared it to old interviews they once believed. Comment sections filled with disbelief. Did he really lie about this for 20 years? How did nobody catch this before? Netflix just ended the entire narrative. But Netflix didn't stop with a contradiction, they showed the pattern. Every time controversy resurfaced, Diddy leaned on this same line. Every time pressure built, he repeated it again. Netflix overlays his interviews from different years, matching his sentences word for word. What once looked like consistency now looked like rehearsed protection. Then Netflix brings out the most damning piece of the puzzle, documents from the early 2000s that match the witness's timeline, not Diddy's. These weren't new documents. They were old, forgotten pieces of history that no one bothered to connect until now. And once Netflix connected them, the truth became clear. The story Diddy defended for 20 years was never real. The documentary even includes an interview with someone who worked closely in the industry at the time. Their comment is blunt. He kept repeating that story because he knew people believed it. Nobody expected anyone to check it. Netflix checked it. They dug through archives, pulled sealed logs, resurfaced old recordings, and reconstructed the timeline from scratch. And what they found wasn't an alternate interpretation. It was the actual truth, buried beneath years of repetition and public confidence. The episode ends with a chilling question. If this part of the story was a lie, what else was? The weight of that question sets the stage for the next chapter, the deeper investigation into how Netflix uncovered this truth and what else they found along the way. The deeper Netflix went into the story, the more unsettling the discovery became. What started as a small inconsistency in Diddy's timeline quickly turned into a trail of contradictions that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And the most shocking part wasn't that the information was new, it was that no one had ever bothered to connect it before. Netflix wasn't reinventing the story, they were finally telling the version that had been buried under 2 decades of confidence and repetition. It began when a researcher on the Netflix team pulled an old box of archived materials from a production that never made it to air. Inside were tapes, logs, transcripts, and handwritten notes dating back more than 20 years. Dusty, forgotten, and untouched since the early 2000s. But as soon as they started reviewing the contents, they noticed something strange. A timestamp that contradicted one of Diddy's most repeated claims. A small detail, but one that didn't match the story he'd told countless times. Netflix didn't dismiss it, they dug deeper. That one timestamp led to an unedited interview that had never been shown to the public. In that recording, a key witness described events with a clarity and consistency that immediately made Diddy's version impossible. Their recollection aligned perfectly with documents found in the archive documents that had been ignored for over a decade because no one realized how valuable they were. Once Netflix realized what they were looking at, they began piecing together a timeline from scratch. They pulled old police logs, media reports, travel records, backstage footage, and even hotel entry logs. Every time they matched evidence to Diddy's public statements, the same disturbing pattern appeared. The story he built for 20 years fell apart piece by piece. The documentary shows this process with quiet precision. No dramatic music, no sensational editing, just cold facts laid out on the screen. A document appears, then a clip of Diddy defending himself, then the contradiction highlighted in red. The more the evidence stacks up, the clearer it becomes that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a simple mistake. It was a narrative crafted so carefully and repeated so consistently that most people never questioned it. But Netflix questioned everything. The team interviewed former industry insiders who admitted they had noticed holes in the story years ago, but were either ignored, pressured, or didn't have enough proof to speak out publicly. One insider's comments stunned viewers. The truth was always there. People just didn't want to look at it. Netflix shows how earlier documentary teams tried to investigate, but were shut down due to legal complications or insufficient verification. But now with access to previously sealed files and interviews, they had everything they needed, including the interview that changed the direction of the documentary entirely. This interview, filmed over a decade ago but never aired, contained details that contradicted Diddy's claim to the minute. The witness wasn't emotional or dramatic, they were matter-of-fact. Their tone, their timeline, and their evidence aligned perfectly with the newly uncovered documents. And once Netflix verified their story with independent records, the conclusion was undeniable. The timeline Diddy had defended for 20 years was false. The documentary moves through this revelation slowly, methodically, almost painfully. Every piece of evidence deepens the contradiction. Every matched timestamp widens the gap between Diddy's narrative and reality. Viewers began to feel the weight of the truth the deeper the episode went. And then comes the moment Netflix hints at something bigger, something even they weren't allowed to show. A blurred document, a blacked-out audio segment, a producer's voiceover explaining that certain material could not be released for legal reasons. That single moment sent viewers into a frenzy. If what Netflix revealed was already this explosive, then what remained hidden must be even more damaging. Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube lit up with theories. Analysts paused screenshots, zoomed in on blurred pages, and speculated about the nature of the redacted segments. What was in those files? Who did they reference? And why couldn't Netflix include them? But even without the redacted material, the truth was devastating. Netflix had exposed the foundation of a lie that survived 20 years because no one had questioned it as deeply as they should have. They had reconstructed the real timeline with such precision that viewers were left wondering how Diddy managed to maintain the false narrative for so long. The episode closes with a haunting line spoken softly over the evidence table. Once the truth begins to surface, it doesn't stop. And that's exactly where the next part of the story begins, the fallout, the panic, the rapid unraveling of a narrative that stood untouched for decades. From the moment Netflix exposed the false timeline, everything began to unravel around Diddy. What had once been a confident, polished narrative suddenly looked fragile, a story stitched together with rehearsed lines and repeated defenses that no longer carried weight. For 20 years, people accepted his version because there was no public evidence powerful enough to challenge it. But now, with the documentary revealing discrepancies in cold detail, that long-held foundation began to crack, and the consequences rippled far beyond the screen. In the days following the documentary's release, the public reaction transformed from curiosity to shock, and from shock to scrutiny. Viewers who once believed the polished, charismatic version of Diddy now found themselves revisiting old interviews, replaying past statements, and analyzing his posture, tone, and language with new eyes. Every confidently delivered line suddenly felt rehearsed. Every emotional denial sounded strategically timed. The documentary didn't just create doubt, it created a new lens through which the last 20 years of his public life were re-examined. And as more people dissected the documentary, a shift occurred. The story was no longer about one contradiction. It was about the realization that if one detail had been false for this long, then every other detail surrounding it needed to be questioned. That doubt seeped into fan communities, industry circles, talk shows, and social media feeds until it became a public phenomenon. For the first time in decades, people weren't simply reacting to accusations. They were rethinking everything they thought they knew. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere around Diddy reportedly shifted dramatically. Individuals who once defended him publicly grew quieter. Associates who once stood firmly in his corner began distancing themselves, not with statements, but with silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any denial. His team, once confident in their ability to control narratives, now appeared overwhelmed, struggling to respond to the documentary's impact. There was no single accusation to push back against, no headline to challenge, no lawyer-crafted statement that could easily counter a timeline built on documented evidence. What made the situation even more destabilizing for Diddy was the fact that the documentary didn't accuse him directly, it simply revealed the truth. A truth that didn't rely on speculation or opinion, but on timestamps, footage, logs, and testimony. You can debate an accusation, you cannot debate time-stamped reality, and that's what made the fallout so powerful. The documentary's final act presents a moment that many viewers described as the collapse of a 20-year myth. Netflix pieces together the full reconstructed timeline, every document, every clip, every overlooked detail brought together in a single, linear sequence. And when the true timeline is shown, something becomes obvious. The version Diddy defended for decades wasn't just off by minutes or hours. It was fundamentally impossible. This realization created an emotional shift in the audience. Some viewers felt betrayed. Others felt fooled. Many wondered how this discrepancy avoided public scrutiny for so long. But the most common reaction was disbelief that a narrative repeated so confidently could be so far from the truth. The online conversation turned into an avalanche of commentary, people posting side-by-side comparisons, influencers breaking down segments, analysts reacting live, journalists revisiting older articles to reinterpret them in light of the new evidence. And then, as if the documentary wasn't already creating enough pressure, a new wave of attention emerged. Former collaborators, industry insiders, and individuals from Diddy's orbit began trending with cryptic comments and vague statements that hinted at deeper issues. No one said anything direct, but their tone carried weight, the tone of people who had been waiting for the moment when the truth would finally surface. Within Diddy's inner circle, the pressure reportedly became intense. Publicists worked overtime trying to craft responses that didn't further damage his image. Advisors debated whether to stay silent or address the documentary. Lawyers warned against saying anything that could be interpreted as an admission. And behind all of it was a growing sense of panic, the realization that the story was no longer under their control. The collapse of a narrative isn't loud. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens slowly, invisibly, like the cracking of a foundation beneath a building until the structure can no longer stand. That's what the documentary did. It cracked the foundation of a public persona built on certainty and repetition. And once that foundation gave way, the entire structure began to shake. Netflix's final scenes lean heavily into this imagery. The filmmaker narrates that the truth doesn't disappear, it waits. Those words hit viewers deeply because this documentary felt like a case of the truth finally running out of patience. Every fact, every detail, every timestamp that had been ignored or misinterpreted for years finally found a place in the narrative where it fit perfectly. And that narrative did not look anything like the one Diddy spent 2 decades reinforcing. As viewers reached the last few minutes of the documentary, something unexpected happened. The tone shifted. After nearly 2 hours of tension, revelations, contradictions, and long-buried evidence resurfacing piece by piece, Netflix made a bold choice. They didn't end with a dramatic crescendo or a loud accusation. Instead, they chose calm, quiet, certainty. It felt intentional, almost poetic, as if the filmmakers wanted the truth to speak louder than any narration ever could. The screen transitions into a slow, steady montage. Documents flash across the frame: emails, notes, interview logs, timestamped footage, handwritten statements, each one representing a moment in time when the truth existed but was ignored, overlooked, or overshadowed by a louder narrative. Witness clips surface next, not chaotic or shocking, but grounded, factual, and eerily consistent with one another. Their voices overlap softly, creating a mosaic of accounts that align so perfectly that the viewer can almost feel the weight of every word being spoken. Then comes the audio fragments, the kind that were once dismissed as unclear or irrelevant, now enhanced, clarified, and contextualized. Layered together, they reveal patterns that no one paid attention to before. Statements once brushed aside now land with undeniable force. The music fades almost completely as the narrator returns, speaking in a tone that feels deliberately different from the rest of the documentary. Slower, heavier. As if acknowledging that the audience is not just watching a film anymore, they are witnessing the unraveling of a 20-year illusion. And then, in one of the documentary's most replayed and widely discussed moments across social media, the narrator delivers a line that instantly became iconic. A lie can last a long time, but it cannot last forever. The screen holds still for a beat, allowing the words to sink in. It's simple, almost too simple, yet devastatingly effective. It captures the essence of everything the documentary uncovered: the fragility of a narrative built on repetition, the endurance of truth, and the inevitable collapse that happens when evidence finally catches up to the myth. Within hours of the release, that single line was everywhere, quoted in Twitter threads, dissected in TikTok breakdowns, debated in podcast roundtables, and used in headlines by entertainment journalists. Some called it the sentence that ended the story. Others said it felt like a warning to anyone still hiding truths behind carefully built public images. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sensational, it was factual, and it struck a nerve. But the documentary's impact extended far beyond one viral quote. In the days that followed, journalists reported that the viewership numbers shattered Netflix projections. Analysts described it as one of the platform's most significant investigative releases in years, not because it relied on shock value, but because it relied on evidence, clarity, and patience. For many viewers, especially those who had followed Diddy's public journey for decades, the documentary felt like seeing the story for the first time without the filters of celebrity, influence, or public relations. People who once accepted Diddy's explanations without question suddenly found themselves rewatching old footage, comparing statements, and spotting contradictions that now seem glaring. Others who were too young to remember the early 2000s, controversies dove into archived interviews and rediscovered how confidently the false narrative had been repeated. The documentary didn't just expose one detail, it exposed the power of repetition and how easily a confident lie can overshadow an inconvenient truth. Still, the deepest consequence wasn't the public's reaction. It was the realization, almost uncomfortable in its simplicity, that a narrative repeated with unwavering confidence for 20 years could crumble in less than 2 hours once the full truth was finally laid out side by side. That realization lingered long after the documentary ended, leaving viewers to question not just Diddy's story, but how many other public narratives have escaped scrutiny simply because no one had the courage or the resources to challenge them. That's what made the documentary feel like more than just entertainment. It felt like a turning point, a moment where evidence outweighed reputation and truth outlasted the most persistent form of storytelling. As the final montage fades, viewers are left staring at a question that feels heavier than anything shown on screen. If this one detail survived unchallenged for 20 years, how many other truths are still waiting to be uncovered? Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you think Diddy ever imagined a documentary would expose a 20-year lie this clearly? And if you want every hidden twist, every buried detail, and every truth they try to silence, make sure you subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. This story isn't just ending, it's only beginning.